Hello, everyone. My name is Katherine Baron. I'm a longtime education reporter and host of The Score, a podcast about academic integrity and cheating. We explore the landscape of cheating in school and delve into the key issues at play in this multifaceted issue challenging academia today. In each episode, we speak with faculty, scholars, or students and ask them to provide insights into what's happening in college and university classrooms and why. How big a problem is it? Who cheats? As well as what policies, regulations, prevention efforts, and changes in teaching and assessment show promise in curbing cheating. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Podcast The Score, that's one word, or stop by our website to download show notes and see our lineup of guests and release dates. Again, that's podcastthescore.com. This episode of The Score is a supplementary addition to our previous conversation with Kylie Day and Sarah Thorneycroft, who designed and implemented a unique approach to learning and testing at the University of New England in Australia. It's an online testing system that gives students flexibility to take an exam at a time that's best suited to them. Sarah and Kylie, welcome back to The Score.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Thank you.
Before we begin, we'd just like to acknowledge that we are located on the traditional lands of the Anawan people here in Armidale in Australia, and we would like to pay our respects to the elders past, present and future.
Thank you for that. Last time, we explained the challenges that students face that led you to create the flexible testing program at the University of New England. Now, let's talk about how it works. The tests are run through an exam center team. My first question is then, how does that work exactly? And is it just at UNE, or is this the process that's used across the country at universities and colleges?
So this is one of my favourite things to talk about in terms of organisational structure. So the notion of having an exam centre doesn't really apply in the online space. We don't have an exam centre. But in terms of how we lead the online examinations program, historically, paper-based exams were treated as an administrative or logistics function. But to us, it's very obvious that exams are an assessment function. It's a teaching and learning practice. So early last year, we went through workplace change and we brought Kylie's team as the exams and e-assessment team, who have experience both in previously doing paper-based exams and now leading online examinations, into the digital education portfolio, which is the portfolio I lead, that also has learning designers, all of the learning environments team. So we have all of the virtual learning environments platforms under our umbrella, learning media. All of the teaching and learning functions are co-located, and so that lets us work really closely with exams as an assessment practice, not as an act of administration, which really lets us hook into the design aspect and the cultural aspect, working with staff to empower them rather than just seeing it as an administrative act where you just schedule things. And that's really important. And it's not something we see a lot in terms of organisational structure, and you said that that's definitely not common in the US context, but I think it's really important to see exams as an assessment practice and not as an administrative function.
And you're right that we do have a central team, and that's been a feature at Australian universities for a long time. But what we've seen at other universities in Australia lately is that's being distributed back out to academic areas. And I would say that's a loss, because I think it requires professional expertise to run what is probably the largest event a university will hold. High stress, high stakes, high numbers of people. Really, really quite important. And to pool that expertise in terms of how do I wrangle 10,000 people without making them cry? To be a little bit cynical, but, that's a skill. How do I communicate with people to achieve compliance with lots of different rules? How do I get people to actually do what they need to do so that everything coincides nicely for everyone and everyone has a good experience? And how do I manage academic integrity issues well? I think distributing that out to academics who already have plenty to do, it might not be their area of expertise, but to outsource that to them as well, I think you lose something there. And I think you get a really good overview at an institution level, having a centralised or integrated team.
I will jump in there and die on my hill that I die on. So we talk about working in integrated ways, and I deliberately don't use the central versus decentralised language. I think it's an important paradigm to disrupt, in that it's not about us versus them. It's the whole university all working together in integrated ways to achieve the goals that we want to achieve. And so we are integrated throughout all of the faculties, but the ways that we work together towards common goals through the unified integrated team is really important. That's my own hill that I die on.
So what is the faculty reaction? How do you bring them into this and gently say, your exam's not quite getting at what you think it is? Just in general, how do you work with a faculty member to teach them essentially how to prepare an exam that gives them the feedback that they want?
I think one of the big things, you use the word change, it's really important to recognise that this is change work, and the things that we are working towards actually call on people to change their mental models, in some cases, the ways that they construct their identities, which can be deeply uncomfortable in some instances. And actually acknowledging that and working into the people piece to build trust and engage staff in what we're all working to achieve is a really important piece. So it's recognising it's not always just about the thing. It's not always about exams. Sometimes it's about you're helping somebody to change, and recognising that that's what you're doing really helps us to create strategies that are more impactful than only talking about assessment design or exam techniques.
So what would be an example of a professor who is very entrenched in an older model and does, have their identity wrapped up in that?
COVID helped us because we were at about 25% online exams before COVID, in the before times. And then we had a very rapid shift to 100% of all exams had to be held online with the 24-hour window and the online proctoring. So that really helped tear the Band-Aid off. And I think it helped people just take that step that they might not have been keen on doing. What my team, put a lot of effort into was to make it really safe for them, and massive amounts of support for students and for staff so that nothing was too hard and that nothing went badly. And that's why we put effort into being on call till 1 a.m. so that there were no stories from students about how they were just left at midnight with no one to help them. And I think that really helped. And when we did have people who wanted to be a bit innovative, we went out of our way to support that. And so those then became the stories, the good examples that we could say, hey, your colleague tried this, and here are the metrics where we can see that student success increased. Students are happier. Students have more agency over all the demands on themselves, so they're much more settled and more engaged, and just supporting that in a really safe way with a lot of support. The whole flexibility piece did take a lot of time for people to get their heads around, and I think that exams exist as a cultural archetype, that they're hard, they're tricky, they're secret, they're tough, you have to turn up or else, all this stuff that people have embedded in their brains about exams. Helping people realise that the way exams have been managed in the past is not necessarily the way exams should be managed, and really calling into question every assumption that people have consciously or unconsciously about assessment and exams and flexibility and students. So it really has been a a long change piece.
When did you start implementing this change?
2017.
So before COVID hit.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Our reasons were not logistical. We had 400 exam venues worldwide, which was massive. But the reason for online exams being initiated was not because logistics. It was so that we could take advantage of the rich media that was available and the flexibility and the institutional resilience that we could get from putting our exams online.
Access to is key for students that don't have to engage in geographical travel to get to locations. That can sometimes be a real barrier for our demographic. So being able to access online in your own home makes a real difference for a lot of students.
We had a student early on who actually rang crying tears of happiness. And no one rings, right, to say what a wonderful exam they've just had, right? Like, it's an occupational hazard in our line of work that you only ever hear from people who have a bad time. But this student rang early on in the project when she really realised that the flexibility that she could have. She rang crying tears of happiness to thank us, to say that she had a spinal injury, which meant she was in chronic pain. Travelling was really hard and would make her really unwell with pain. And that, you know, she asked for a comfortable chair, but our idea of comfortable chair was not the same as her idea. And we couldn't provide what she needed in the exam venue. When she realised that she had 3 exams in 2 days, and she physically was not going to be able to do that at an exam centre, which meant that she wasn't going to finish her degree, which meant that she wasn't going to be able to get that job that she had lined up, this dream job. Once she realised that she could actually choose the timing of her 3 exams and sit one on a weekend, sitting in her lounge chair, which was much better for her, and lay down if she needed to, she realised that she could access those exams. She could finish her degree. She was going to get that dream job that she'd lined up. And that moved her to tears, and probably moved us to tears a bit too when she rang to tell us that. So that's, you know, exams are an institutional barrier. Traditional exams are an institutional barrier to accessibility.
You mentioned metrics earlier, showing one professor the metrics from another one. And I'm wondering about data. What kind of data have you been able to generate, and what has it shown you about designing better exams, or what students need, anything like that? You know, does it help you when you're developing all these second and third questions so that they can be rotated around? Does it help in that area too?
It's certainly easier to get those metrics in an online assessment mode rather than paper. From my perspective, we do a survey after every exam period to say, how was it? Which bits were good? Which bits were bad? Why did you like it? Why didn't you like it? What impact did it have? And we also get various other pieces of feedback. And what we know is that students really appreciate being able to choose a time that suits them. They don't like having to sit in an exam hall with 300 other people sniffling and tapping and wobbling their desks. They don't like having to travel. But I think Sarah can speak on the kind of metrics that you could get that would influence design.
So in terms of designing our approach, getting metrics around when students choose to have their exams is really useful, because you can actually see the uptake of flexibility, you know, and understand when you make this available to students, how are they making use of it? And thus, to what extent you want to make sure you're designing your assessments to maximise that capacity. And some of the other metrics, I know that some of the ones that we use a lot are around things like the test taker experience. So this isn't necessarily about the design of assessment. I think a lot of the most effective actions you can take for assessment design are the things that don't look like assessment design. Metrics around the test taker experience in terms of satisfaction, technical issues, academic integrity issues, the incidence of actual confirmed breaches and that kind of thing. We've talked about anxiety a lot, And where there's anxiety, there's often cognitive phenomena like catastrophizing, and it's often hard to understand the overall context when you have one negative experience in front of you. So we do a lot of work using the data to actually provide that broader context to understand that actually the incidence of confirmed cheating is very low, that the overall satisfaction is actually extremely high. You know, when you're talking about an academic, or you probably use the term professor, who's, you know, talking to a student who had a bad experience in the exam, that's really easy to understand as, oh, actually online exams are bad. But understanding that out of 10,000 exams, you know, 85 to 90% of students are having a really positive experience, which in grading terms, I'm not sure if this translates well to the US context, but that's a high distinction, right? And so actually using data to help illustrate the whole context rather than single sample sizes is really useful, because then when the anxiety reduces about the medium, about the phenomenon of online exams, then that means you've got much more attention and engagement that you can spend on the assessment design that you can expend on the student experience.
So how expensive is your system?
It's on a par with external exams per exam sitting. I think it's actually, these days it's probably a lot cheaper, because we had, 400 exam venues worldwide, and renting a room at the Australian Embassy in Paris might cost €600 for a day, but the bigger church hall in Australia is, they charge you 50 cents electricity a day. So it's hard to really come up with a round figure, but it's comparable with off-campus exams, indirect costs. But when you also consider when we had, hundreds of casual staff that we had on employment contracts, we did payroll, we had hundreds of invoices, so all the extraneous activity around us to process the HR, the finance, the insurance, the workplace health and safety risk, just the paper and the printing and the postage, all of those things we don't have to worry about. But I think the value of it really was obvious during COVID, during the lockdowns, that we were able to continue functioning as normal. It was definitely not as painful for UNE to deal with the lockdowns, because we're already online. And so we have that institutional resilience piece. With paper exams in the past, we were always dealing with civil unrest, floods, fires. We actually held exams in Fukushima when the reactor blew up. We were, our students are SAS soldiers and federal police and foreign aid workers and elite athletes, and they're moving all around the world dealing with all the complicated things that are happening, and we were trying to hold exams in amongst all of that. So that was hard. We don't have to worry about that anymore, which is a good thing.
Yeah, the intangible costs are an important part of the conversation. In terms of dollars, for instance, it's reasonably more expensive than our learning management system, just as an example. But the key thing is, because human invigilation, human proctoring is a key part of our strategy, it's not a platform cost, it's people. It's people cost. So I think it's important to contextualize that way, is that it's not a really expensive piece of technology. It's actually a part of a whole ecosystem, and it's paying for the human experience.
So we're not obsolete yet. That's good to know.
No, and we get lovely data. So, during 2020, we were able to use just the booking information to make sure that our learning management servers, had the capacity for the number of concurrent users that we expected. And the flexibility where we can say to students, even when there's no electricity or no internet, if someone breaks the internet, we can still say to students, how about tomorrow? Instead of with paper-based exams, we'd have to say, we will organise it for you in 3 months' time. By then, they're not, it's too hard for them. But if they're ready, willing and able today, but the internet is broken, then we can make it so they can do it tomorrow and they can progress.
Yeah, there's all sorts of cost, time cost, well-being cost.
Kylie and Sarah, thank you so much for joining us on this supplementary episode of The Score. Kylie Day is the Manager of Exams and E-Assessments at the University of New England in Australia, and Sarah Thorneycroft is the Director of Digital Education. You've been listening to The Score. I'm Katherine Baron.